Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the CAMTA October program. We have today Dr. Andrew Talle from Northwestern University here. Dr. Talle is a musicology professor there and focuses on J.S. Bach and especially on the musical culture at his time. It might be interesting to mention that Dr. Talle started off as a cello major at Northwestern and switched then to musicology during his master's. He got his PhD degree at Harvard, taught there for a year. Then he taught also at Peabody Conservatory and joined Northwestern in 2017. I also want to mention that Dr. Talle is almost every year for a couple of months in Germany to do his research on J.S. Bach. And today he will present about teaching music to children in the time of J.S. Bach. Please welcome with me, Dr. Andrew Talle. Disclaimer, so our programs are recorded and will be posted on the CAMTA programs YouTube channel. If you have questions, you are welcome to ask them in the chat. You are welcome to ask them during the presentation of Dr. Talle. If you would like not to appear on the video, then please put your questions in the chat or refrain until the end. And you can post them after I turn off the recording. Thank you so much. Yes, Andrew.
Okay, thank you, everyone. This presentation is about an hour long, with including the questions and such. I wasn't entirely sure, Yumi, if I should leave time at the end for the last 15 minutes for questions, or if I should just talk the whole time. But I'll adjust as necessary. Good. So thank you very much for the invitation and for the introduction. I'm very glad to be here. This is a topic very dear to my heart, and I think it will be of interest to you as musicians, as teachers of music. I was curious to know too, when I began this research, how real people lived in the time of J.S. Bach. That is, how musicians were, what their lives were like, what their daily lives were like, how they found students, how they interacted with students, what lessons were like. And it happens that I focused especially on keyboard playing and keyboard teaching in this time. So it seems especially appropriate for your group. I'm going to share my screen and begin a PowerPoint presentation. Here it goes. Is this working properly? Are you able to see the title and such? Okay, good. So my presentation today is entitled Teaching Music to Children in the Time of J.S. Bach. And much of what I'm presenting today was published in a book that that appeared in 2017, the same year I came to Northwestern, entitled Beyond Bach, Music and Everyday Life in the 18th Century. And this was a real labor of love for me. It took me a long time to write it. It's based to some extent on my dissertation that I finished 15 years earlier. I did some other things in the meantime, but this was really kind of my main work for about 15 years. And I visited Germany many times. I spent years there. I did a lot of research in archives and such. And my goal was to understand again what it was like for musicians day to day in J.S. Bach's Leipzig, and especially in other parts of Protestant Germany. So basically this presentation is divided into two parts. In the first part, I will talk about the teacher's perspective. That is what it was like to lead a life as an organist and as a music teacher in this time. And in the second part, I will talk about what it was like to be a student in this time. And I'll focus in particular on the musical lives of two teenage girls whose lives are relatively well documented. I chose these people not because they're the greatest musicians of the time or anything like that. They're not famous at all, but because their lives are unusually well documented. So in a sense, they chose me. Or I mean, I don't know, they didn't choose me. Somebody chose me because their materials survived when most materials from this time documenting the lives of teachers and music students do not survive. So here's part one, the daily life of a music teacher. Some years ago, I was corresponding with an archive, and I came upon this document here that you'll see on your screen. I'm not sure how many of you are able to read German, or especially ancient German handwriting. Cynthia, I see a German dictionary behind you on the shelf, but I'm not sure that that's going to come in handy here, because you have to read the actual text. It says, kleine Wirtschaftsrechnung über Einnahme und Ausgabe, angefangen Kürten den 2. Januar 1752. So this is an account book of an organist that was begun on January 2nd, 1752. The name of the organist is Karl August Hartung. Mr. Hartung's account book begins in 1752 and it ends in 1765. And over those roughly 13 years, he documented every penny that he spent, or every Pfennig that he spent, and every penny that he earned. And so this is a really interesting source of information about the daily life of an organist or a musician. Bach obviously had died in 1750. This isn't technically Bach's time, but is very close. And the lives of organists and other music teachers changed slowly. So they didn't, I think that this certainly, his life does give us a strong indication of what the lives of comparable musicians were like in the time that 50 years earlier when Bach was growing up. So he lived in Curtin, where Bach had also lived from 1717 to 1723. And then in 1760, Mr. Hartung moved to the city of Braunschweig, or we call it in English, Brunswick. And he lived there, in fact, until 1800. He didn't die until many years later. In fact, he was the teacher of Louis Spohr, if any of you know Louis Spohr, who also grew up in Braunschweig. But the account book I'm talking about only covers these 13 years, during which Mr. Hartung was 29 to 42. So it's really kind of his early professional career. This is what the book itself looks like. This is what a typical page looks like. And you'll see here, for example, an entry that I've highlighted for his salary payment, which was quarterly. He was, in this time, he was serving as a teacher at an orphanage in Curtin. So he was not a professional musician, technically. He was doing music kind of on the side, but his salaried work came from teaching other subjects, including music, in this orphanage. Here is he also played at a church, and he here had some income from the offering at the church. Here we see a payment. This is all his income payments. Here we see a payment for playing at a Trauer. Does anyone know what a Trauer is? A Trauer is a wedding. So he's getting paid for playing at a wedding. And you can see that his customers are soldiers stationed in Curtin. So he's playing kind of, I would say, the weddings for people who don't have all that much money. Soldiers were typically not paid very well. Here we have also a payment for a Taufe, and many others on this same page. A Taufe is a baptism. So he's playing at the baptisms of the children of these soldiers and of other people in town. Here, in most cases, we see that he earned 6 groschen for his playing at a baptism. But in this case, where I'm highlighting here, he earned 12. And the question is why? And in fact, Mr. Hartung offers an explanatory note. He says, this was the baptism of lackey Mr. Eisenberg, and he had to pay double because the baby was born just 2 weeks after the wedding, which was, scandalous back then, and people were charged double for even you had to pay the organist double at the baptism if your baby was born effectively out of wedlock, or sort of conceived out of wedlock. And there were all kinds of punishments and fines for people that had children that were quote unquote illegitimate. But it's interesting that this even filters up to the daily life of an organist, that he gets to charge double for this sort of thing. Mr. Hartung also composed. Here he's writing a piece of music, a kind of cantata for a school play. He also taught musical subjects. So here, I'm sorry, non-musical subjects. So here he's got he's getting paid for teaching Latin. Here he's getting paid for 6 weeks of school, where he has, except that he was ill during some of this time, and he was very angry with the students that didn't pay him while he was ill or went to different schools. This was a time when everyone kind of found their own private school in town, and they would just have to pay a teacher like this guy at the orphanage to instruct their children for a certain number of hours a day. So he was kind of a daycare instructor / teacher. But in this time, this documents in 1758, a time when he was sick, and he was very upset with the students who left for other schools. Let's see, here he's teaching music. So for example, here's a payment to Mr. Hartung from a woman named Gerlach, her last name. She's referred to here as the Jungfer Gerlachin, the maiden Ms. Gerlach, so unmarried woman, for 12 hours of keyboard instruction. Here we see a certain Monsieur Bercher, who was who paid Hartung for 48 hours of keyboard instruction. And here Monsieur Laetius, who also paid for a quarter year of keyboard instruction. And this actually makes up a large part of his income during this time. I wanted to know who these people were, Gerlach and Laetius and the rest of them. Like I had to figure this out on the basis of often just knowing their gender and their last name. And the way that you do that for this region of Germany is you go to this church that's on the picture here. This is the Markuskirche in the town of Dessau. And it's there that they keep all of the baptismal and marriage records for this region, which included the town of Curtin, where, again, Bach had lived for a time. This is the door of that church. And above the door, you'll see a picture of Moses pointing to the commandments. It looks like this up close. And the funny thing is, at the time when I visited, when you go into the church, then you meet this guy who looks exactly the same as on the door of the church. This is Herr Preco, and Herr Preco was very helpful to me and was able to, with his help, you can see the documents laid out there, he enabled me to find the baptismal records of all these people. So I wanted to know how old they were and what they were, what their parents did for work and that sort of thing. I wanted to know as much about these students of Mr. Hartung as I could. And I made a big database here where you can see some of that information. So if we look at just the ages across the board, I wasn't able to figure this out for everyone, but of all these students, you can see that their average age was, in the mid-teens or something like that. You didn't have people, at least I didn't find people that were starting the keyboard. Like my son has lessons with Yumi and he's only 5. And that was really unusual back then, at least according to my research. It was more typical to start around 10 or 12. The parents of these students were a variety of professions. You can see here some of them were court employees, as Bach had been in Curtin. There was a big court kind of presence. There was a palace in the middle. You can still visit today, actually. And many of the parents of his keyboard students worked in that palace. Others were pastors, as you see here, or merchants. Others were schoolmasters, and in one case, Mr. Hartung was also giving lessons to his colleague, a fellow teacher at the orphanage. And some were bakers, weavers, button makers, brewers, and such, the people that worked with their hands more, farmers also. And they would also sometimes send their children to have keyboard lessons with this local organist. And some were orphans themselves, kids that lived in this orphanage whose parents had died and were also interested in learning music or thought that it would help them in their careers. Let's just take a look at this one guy as an example, Mr. Geisler, who was 12 or 13 years old in this time. Hartung has a note here that says he discounted the lessons because Mr. Geisler's father is a good friend. He's discounting the keyboard lessons in a way that you probably are also familiar with. One has social relationships with the families of the people who have lessons with us. Here's a Gebhardt, Mr. Gebhardt I wanted to also look at because there's an interesting note about him. It says that he had keyboard lessons for a long time, but then he stopped because he wanted to become a button maker. And that's kind of interesting. The because is what's interesting to me here, because there seems to be a causal relationship. He decided to become a button maker, so he just stopped his keyboard lessons. That before that, maybe he was planning to pursue a career in music, but that with this decision to become a button maker, his plans changed and he no longer needed keyboard lessons. So it sort of explains his decision just with that one interesting word, because. Here we have another example, a certain Mr. Johann Martin Schröter, who was 15 to 16 years old when he was having lessons at the keyboard. His father was a farmer and a butcher. And so here are just some normal lesson payments that Mr. Schröter made. But then here's one that's unusual. It's much less than the others. And it says, Mr. Schröter should have paid me twice as much, but he didn't because I charged him just half of what he owed because animal death was visited upon his family. And by that, he's not referring to the family itself being in danger, but rather they're ranchers, they're raising animals. And there was some kind of plague or some kind of illness that killed off a lot of the animals belonging to this farmer, Mr. Schröter's father. And for that reason, Hartung decided to charge them just half of what they technically owed him for the keyboard lessons, really out of sympathy for the family. So it's kind of the opposite, really, of charging double for the baptism of the illegitimate kid. Here he's discounting half because of this personal relationship. And one senses here the nexus of personal connections, the web of personal connections that were present for keyboard teachers, for music teachers in this time. They weren't just music teachers. They also knew these people personally. And in fact, in this case, there's another entry here, and this is in the expenditures department of the account book. Mr. Hartung writes, I went out to Groß Paschleben, where the farm was of Mr. Schröter, and I bought 3 geese. In no other case did he buy geese in this entire account book, but he bought 3 whole geese, presumably, again, out of sympathy for his student's family, because they were having tough times. He discounted the lessons halfway, and he went and bought 3 geese as well. And he even makes a note here, welche meinem Bruder geschenket, ich hab aber mitgegessen. He says, I gave the 3 geese to my brother, who was a cook at the court, but I helped eat them too. So he's also involved as a participant in this, benefiting too from having bought these geese. Mr. Hartung sold printed music through to his students, and it was often the job of a keyboard teacher to provide the sheet music from which the students then played, whether by copying by hand or arranging for sales. That most keyboard teachers were simultaneously kind of music stores for their students, that they were the primary source for keyboard music if they were studying the keyboard. And here's a good example. So Mr. Lambelet purchased a collection of music by Tischer, Johann Nikolaus Tischer, who was a very popular keyboard composer in these years. And here's an example of the publication that he purchased. Interestingly, it was a man who purchased this, and the music is, as those who read German will recognize, it says Klavierübung für das Frauenzimmer, that is for women. But so we shouldn't be confused into thinking that all music published for women was actually only played by women. Sometimes it was played by men as well. As I said, the job of a keyboard teacher was often to copy music as well for the students. So for example, here, Mr. Hartung copies an entire opera for one of his students, and he's paid not in cash, but he's exchanged this copy of an entire opera. Must have taken him a week to copy all the notes with his quill pen and such. And it says, instead of money, he gave me a nightgown of cotton and also a bowl of butter. So there's a sort of bartering system. It wasn't just cash that was being exchanged for music. Mr. Hartung was a huge fan of Johann Sebastian Bach, which was kind of unusual at this time. Not everyone loved Bach's music, but Hartung did. And he even made a catalog of music by Bach that he had available to his students and to others that approached him. So that if you wanted to have some piece by Bach, you could get this catalog. It wasn't printed. He had manuscript copies of that as well. But you could look up the piece in this little catalog. This is Hartung's own handwriting. And does anyone recognize this piece? Are you able to hear that if I play? Okay. Here's another page of the catalog. Anyone recognize these pieces? I'll play the second one. And here, another page. You can probably recognize this despite the handwriting. So the Goldberg variations. Below that is the Art of the Fugue. Hartung had a tremendous collection of Bach's music. It was really unusual for this time. And people who were interested could approach him and ask him to make copies of it that he would then make by hand and charge them according to how many pages it occupied. This isn't really the conclusion. This is just sort of the midpoint of this talk. But I wanted to ask rhetorically, is Mr. Hartung typical? How can we know if this was normal? My sense from looking at these documents and many, many others is that he was basically typical in some ways. The trajectory of his career was typical. He was, insofar as he was an organist for a while at this orphanage, but then moved on to become a professional organist. And also cobbling together different sources of income early in his career, especially between music teaching and teaching other subjects like Latin and math, and also his efforts to compose and earn money that way, to copy music for people, to play at weddings and baptisms and such. That was all quite normal. We might ask, why should we care? 200 years later, 300 years later. But I think it's important to remind ourselves that the golden age of classical music, the time of Bach and Mozart and Haydn, was not a mythological time, that there were real people living in this era. And not all of them were interested in the most avant-garde music, the music that we admire most from our perspective in the 21st century. Much of the work of musicians, as I said, was non-musical in nature. Mr. Hartung's salary paid a relatively small proportion of his income. Most of his income came from teaching privately rather than from the institution. It helped to be attached to an institution, just like I think it probably helps if you live in Connecticut and you can teach 5 students at Juilliard pre-college, you can go back to Connecticut during the week and teach dozens more students and charge them far more than you would have because of your association with Juilliard. And the same was kind of true in Bach's time. If you were an organist and had a prominent position in town at a church, that was much better, even if that didn't pay you much. That salary didn't pay you much, just as Juilliard doesn't pay its pre-college teachers very well. You have still the possibility of earning more income through other work, and that was also typical. And as I offered with those examples of Hartung, taking mercy on his students, charging less, buying geese from their families when their families were suffering and such, these teachers and students were entwined very much together. And he also accepted work in kind from his students, just as you might have a student, redesign your website or something like that, if they're good at that sort of thing. Hartung also had his students help him with various kinds of tasks, things that were important to him. And the central point of identification is the music. So it's interesting to me that, I'm a big fan of Bach's music, and it's sort of I feel a connection with people in the past like Mr. Hartung, because just as when he was wandering through Curtin on his way somewhere with carrying a lantern, if it was at night, in his leather pants that he had regularly blackened to avoid getting them, to keep the water out and such, and with his hat that also had to be covered in tar regularly so that it would also remain waterproof. I mean, so many things were different about his life, and yet it was the Goldberg Variations theme that was going through his head the whole time he was doing this, just as that might go through our minds as we're going about our work. And that the music provides an interesting kind of bridge to people in the 18th century, to music teachers and to other people who had the same interest in music that we might have. I want to pivot now and actually look at the student's perspective. These are people who had nothing to do with my first case study, Mr. Hartung. They're discussed in a different chapter of my book, but I think they'll be of interest to you as well. And they are 2 teenage girls whose musical lives are also unusually well documented. So in 1968, someone was going through the attic of a castle in West Germany near Frankfurt am Main, and happened upon a chest that was just a wooden chest that hadn't been opened for many, many decades. And they opened it up and found that it was full of music manuscripts from the 18th century that looked just like the one that's on your screen now. It says B tonus, that is B-flat tonality, by various authors for the clavecin, for the keyboard, for LCCZE, these initials of the recipient. And then it says anno, the year, and in Roman numerals is a long Roman numeral, but it says 1742. So B flat major, 1742 for LCCZE. Some of the manuscripts, let's look at this. The initials refer to Louisa Charlotte, Comtesse zu Eppstein, the Countess of Eppstein, who was born in 1727. So in 1742 to 44, when these manuscripts were being prepared, she was 14 to 17 years old. Many of the other manuscripts look like this. Here's a concerto for keyboard and violin 1, violin 2, and viola. the cello is implicit. The cellist always sat right behind the keyboardist and just looked at the bass line and played that. They didn't need their own special parts. This is by a composer named Förster in C major. And at the bottom, you see DST, which is an abbreviation for the city of Darmstadt, 1743, July, and then the letters ME, which I'll get to shortly. But the first name I want to deal with here is the initials FSCZE. And that refers to Friederike Sophia, the Comtesse zu Epstein, who was born 3 years after her sister, was ages 11 to 14 in the time when all these manuscripts were discovered. There are about 50 manuscripts of keyboard music in this chest. And the whole thing was cataloged, and there was even a little book about the, printed catalog that came out many years ago. But nobody really did anything with this collection for a long time until I got interested in it, and I devoted a lot of time and attention to it, because it really is, it wasn't recognized until I did this work that this is really, these are the two teenage girls of Bach's time and place who are best documented. There is no other source that so richly reveals what the musical lives of teenagers were like in this time. Here's a picture of Friederike Sophia. I don't have a picture of her sister, and this is from considerably later than these manuscripts were prepared. The two girls, you can see their names in red at the bottom of your screen. Luisa Charlotte, born in 1727, Friederike Sophia, born in 1730. They're the daughters of Ernst Ludwig, the Count of Hessen-Darmstadt, and his second wife. Here's a picture of him, and his second wife, Luisa Sophia von Spiegel zum Desenberg. They were married on January 20th, 1727, after he'd had all these other children. On the left side of your screen, he'd had these other children with his first wife, who died in 1705. And for a long time, more than 20 years, the Count of Hessen-Darmstadt was single, but then he got kind of entangled with this lady, Luisa Sophia, and here she is, she's sort of a frosty looking lady. They had a relationship, and she had this daughter, Luisa Charlotte, just 2 months after their wedding. Again, with this guy. He died just a short time after that. So these girls really didn't know their father very well, but they came to regard one of their half-brothers, this guy, Ludwig VIII of Hessen-Darmstadt, who succeeded his father as Count of Hessen-Darmstadt. They came to regard him as a father figure and really depend upon him. It was a difficult kind of relationship because the children of the first marriage were not very happy about the second marriage, and they wanted to keep these two girls outside the line of inheritance. It was a very tense situation. But as we'll see, these two girls managed, in part through their keyboard playing, to charm the people at court and to build a positive relationship with their older half-brother, who became a kind of father figure. After the death of her husband, the Countess's mother moves to a town called Rauschenberg, where she had a castle from her previous marriage. And it's very far away from Darmstadt. So she was really kind of trying to manage her daughter's lives by remote control. And of course, that was harder in the days before real remote controls existed. She was, many days carriage ride away. But she did try to set up for them dance lessons. Here's a document. We won't go through this, but it attests to the performance of these two teenage daughters of hers at a dance where they apparently did very well and impressed everybody. And here they also wanted to, the mother also wanted her daughters to study music. And here are some of the music manuscripts that were prepared on behalf of her daughter or her daughters by a scribe who we'll get to in a second. But here's just some music. This is actually a piece by François Couperin called Les Bergeries. Also, this is a piece that also appears in Anna Magdalena Bach's keyboard notebook from 1725, just coincidentally. It must have been beloved by musicians, amateur musicians of this era. It sounds like this. Here's another piece, this one by Rameau. It's attributed here incorrectly to Grell, who was a Swedish composer, but it's really by Rameau. And this is characteristic of this collection insofar as it has words. This is la poule, so the chicken, and it's meant to imitate the sounds of a chicken at the beginning. So this is, in a way, kind of childish programmatic music. You can see that most of this music is fast. I looked at all the tempo indications and the other titles and found that, as you can see just from the numbers, that there are very few slow pieces here. There are a couple of sarabands at the very bottom of this list, but for the most part, the music is relatively quick, rather than slow and contemplative, and that has its purpose. There's also here are the composers whose music is featured, and the number next to their names indicates how many movements composed by that person are in this collection. You can see that J.S. Bach is not very popular. There's just one work by Bach, one movement by Bach. Does anyone have a guess as to what it could be? What do you think that this is by far the most popular piece by J.S. Bach in his lifetime and probably in the 50 years after he died? Anyone have any suggestions? I mean, for some reason, I'm not able to look at the chat. The chat is up here someplace, but
Goldberg Variations.
That's my favorite, but that was not the favorite at the time. The favorite piece at the time, we'll have one more guess. Let's see if anyone can get it.
The Prelude in C major.
Another good guess, but no.
One of the minuets, maybe?
Yep, it could be. I mean, minuet is also a plausible choice, but actually, maybe you're going to be surprised. There was one movement that by Bach that appeared in this collection, the Klavierübung Part 1. It's the Gigue from the first partita in B flat major with a hand crossing. That piece was by far the greatest hit of Bach's lifetime. If you knew any single piece by J.S. Bach before 1800, it was almost certainly that one.
That's why it's in the Suzuki books.
Yeah, maybe. Didn't even know that, but that explains that. You know this piece, but I'll play the beginning of it just to have it in your ears. This piece is drawn obviously from a longer work by J.S. Bach. And it appears in this collection. So on the left side is Bach's original conception of this piece, as the last movement of a partita. And on the right side is where it appears in this collection of music prepared for one of these two countesses. It's not even called Gigue anymore. It's called Allegro by Mr. Bach. And it appears in a collection consisting entirely of music in B flat major. So every piece in this collection is written in B flat major. And this is characteristic of this pile of manuscripts found in the chest. They're almost always organized by key. So you have a big collection of music prepared by a scribe in C minor. And then you have another big collection with lots and lots of different composers. And then you have another collection in B minor or in G major or whatever. It's always organized by key, or usually organized by key. Here are some other examples: pieces by Handel that were drawn into this collection, pieces by Graupner that were drawn in. You can see how kind of mixed up they are. They're not in the right order. People treated this music by famous composers like Bach and Handel and Graupner. They treated it very roughly. They weren't concerned about the students playing all the movements of a given partita or something like that. They would just take what they thought was useful. This piece is cute. It's got nice hand crossing. Let's use that. And it's in B flat major. So it's going to go in a big pile of other music in B flat major. Does anyone have any thoughts about why these keyboard teachers might have organized the music according to key?
I think we all teach that way too.
Do you?
Sure.
Do you have students
Well,
play?
that way they get to know that key better than any others. And also the tuning on the harpsichord probably was affected by the key.
I think that's right. I think we do probably, I say we collectively, we do teach according to key to some extent, but it's unusual, I think, to have your student play music by 15 different composers over the course of 3 months, all of it in B flat major. I mean, that's probably not something we do too often anymore, but apparently that was what was going on here. But your second point about the harpsichord, I think you're certainly right there, that this had something to do with temperament, so that the keyboard teacher could tune up the harpsichord into B flat major, and then the girls could play all afternoon without having to adjust the tuning. So that probably helps explain why they stayed within a key as well, in addition to the pedagogical reasons that you outlined. Here is, I'm back to the title page of one of these manuscripts. This says Darmstadt 1743, 8BR, which means October, and then the initials ME. Here's another one, Darmstadt 1743, July, M, and then it's not, if you see, this one just has ME, but this has something in between the M and the E. I was very eager to figure out who this was, because I thought this must be the identity of the teacher, that the teacher and the scribe would have prepared this music on behalf of the students. And I wanted to know who that person was. I wanted to find out everything I could about his or her biography. And fortunately, after looking through 50 manuscripts at the State Library in Berlin, I found one that had a teeny bit more information here. You can see we go from nothing between the M and the E to this sort of weird thing between the M and the E. And then this one looks like MRLE. And that was interesting to me, because then I went to the archive in Darmstadt and I found a letter here in which a certain teacher named Mr. Merle is being praised for having instructed these two countesses in religion, not in music, but they passed their confirmation exams and everyone was very proud of Mr. Merle because he did such a good job. And I thought MRLE, like that, it looks enough like this that I thought, it could be. So I went through the university matriculation records and I found that there was a guy named Johannes Merle from Rauschenberg who had studied at the University of Marburg. And the interesting thing to me about this is that I remembered that the Countess's mom had a castle in Rauschenberg. And remember, it's far away. It's a tiny little town. There were probably 14 people living there in 1742. I mean, maybe 100 or something, but not very many. And there are still not very many people there. But I decided I would do my best. I wanted to know more about this person. I wanted to know when he was born, and I wanted to know about his upbringing and anything else I could learn about this guy, because I thought that maybe he was the teacher of these countesses. And if I could find a writing sample from him, just an example of his handwriting, maybe I could match that to the movement titles in the countess's music manuscripts. because they're all written but in the same handwriting. So I Googled, I looked around on the internet, and I found that there was a little teeny museum called the Heimat Museum, the Homeland Museum of the town of Rauschenberg. And I called. They were only open from like 1 to 1:45 on Sundays or something like that. And so I called waited till Sunday, and I called them, and I got a very nice guy on the phone, and I said, look, I want to know if is there any information that you have about this guy, Johannes Merle, who studied, the university in Marburg in 1729. So he was probably born around, I don't know, 1715 or 1712, something like that. Is there any hope of finding some biographical information about this guy? Because I think he might be important for my research. And the museum director told me, oh, I've only lived here for 30 years. I don't know anything. I can't possibly help you. But just give me a call next week, and I'll see if I've found anything. So I waited a week very patiently, and I called him again at 1 o'clock on Sunday, the following week. And he said, "Ich hab was für Sie," like, I have something for you. And I said, great, what is it? He said, well, I didn't know what to do. So you said the guy's name was Johannes Merle, right? So I decided to go down the street and ask Mrs. Merle. And I thought, wow, that's incredible. And he said, and she has a cousin who's really into genealogy. And she was able to figure out that this Johannes Merle became a pastor later in his life, much later, in the area around Darmstadt, which is interesting to me because that's where my guy was giving his keyboard lessons. And if you discovered that someone was a pastor and you're looking for a writing sample, it's very good news that he was a pastor, because the pastor's job was to keep all the baptismal and the wedding and the other records. It's all in his handwriting at his little parish. And so I was able to visit actually the town where he had been a pastor, get the old church books, and very, to my glee, match perfectly the handwriting in these old books of church records with the handwriting in the music manuscripts. So it is certainly the same guy. And at that point, then I learned quite a lot more about him. He was born in 1709, died in 1783. He grew up in this town of Rauschenberg. His father was a pastor as well, and had been the pastor to the mother of the countesses. So it's easy to imagine this mother, in a small town, reaching out to her pastor, learning or knowing that he had a boy of university age, and saying, do you think your son could go down to Darmstadt and teach my girls religion and music? And that in this way, she could this is her means of remote control, right? She can kind of monitor the situation. He can report back to her. She's got this guy under her thumb because her pastor is the father of this keyboard teacher. So all that really added up very nicely into an interesting story. It doesn't answer the question, however, of whether these countesses actually wanted to be having music lessons or not. I wanted to know more about their perspective, and whether they were really invested in their music lessons, or, as I'm sure you've had the experience of teaching students who were not as invested in their music lessons. Was this just something the mom was foisting on these girls, or were they really into it? And there are little clues in the music collection that I was able to find. For example, here at the very top of the page, you see this is a piece of music by a composer named Platti. And at the top it says, Luisa Charlotte gives this manuscript to Frederica Sophia. The word cediert, cedes, to C-E-D-E, cedes this manuscript to her sister. And that would suggest that these manuscripts had some value for these girls, that it was important to document who owned what, and that they were, when one passed from ownership from one to the other, that it was important to document that on the page. And that suggests a degree of investment. Better evidence comes from this. for example, here you have a piece of music that is not in the hands of Johann Merle, but rather in the hand of Louisa Charlotte herself. She had a keyboard instructor whose job it was to write out music for her, but she insisted in this case, and in a few other cases, she insisted on writing it out herself. And you can tell that she's doing it because she's not very experienced at writing out music. Does anyone see any problems with what you see on the screen there? Anything to correct?
Stems on the wrong side, and it looks like there are not always the correct number of beats in a measure.
That's right. This is a piece in 3/4, and you often have 6 quarter notes in a measure. The stems thing was very non-standard in this time, so that's not really wrong. The direction of the stems going upward from the right side or the left side. But the fact that there are no beams, these are all 8th notes, and she wrote quarter notes, is a bigger issue. Clearly, this was somebody who didn't have a lot of experience doing this, but she wanted to take the initiative. She actually seems to have cared enough about this that she's doing work that she wasn't expected to do, certainly didn't have to do. And that's in 1744 when she was 16 years old. The even better evidence that they cared about their music lessons comes from this. This is one of the manuscripts that says, Sonata for solo keyboard in C major by the illustrious Mademoiselle Frederica Sophia zu Epstein. So it's saying, it's Mr. Merle is writing out here this manuscript and preparing it just as he would prepare a manuscript of music by Bach, but the composer is Frederica Sophia herself. And the music looks like, and by the way, so Darmstadt, 1744, she was 13 at the time she did this. The music looks like this. There's nothing there. But later, he promises an entire sonata. The first movement is missing, but there are a couple of minuets, and they sound like this. Here, Mr. Merle wrote out this music as well. This is now his handwriting, but he's claiming to be writing out the music composed by his 13-year-old lady student. Here we go. Pretty good, right? Here is the second minuet, and this is actually in Frederica Sophia's own handwriting. And you can see that she also is not very experienced at writing out music, but the music itself that she's copying is quite well composed, I think. Here's just the beginning of this piece. I'll only play the beginning in the interest of time. Frederica Sophia also composed a little march that's here on some scratch paper started by her sister. You can see at the top, Louisa Charlotte copies the first 2 measures of a piece in 2/4, but she accidentally beams it in 3/8 and gets mixed up and throws away the piece of paper. And her sister then writes this little march on the remaining paper, since this became scratch paper as soon as her sister gave up on it. Here is more notes for that. This is a note also going back to the relationship of these girls and their half brother, who was a kind of father figure. They're begging him here to go to the opera house, and they say that you have shown some pleasure in our musical performances in the past, and we would love to go to the opera. So clearly their half-brother and other courtiers were among the audience members for their performances. They liked to sing also, but they played the keyboard. That in a sense, one can see that these music lessons kind of paid off for these girls who were in a very awkward social position. The children of in what's called a morganatic marriage that's outside the main line of inheritance. They are subject to derision or contempt from certain quarters at court, including many of their half siblings. But this brother, who was their kind of patron, and to whom they turned for everything from opera tickets to more sugar for their tea, he became their protector. And this is documented also in the materials I found in Darmstadt, that at one point when these girls were suffering abuse at the hands of the other ladies at court, their half-brother called everyone together, and this is the report of that event, made a grand assembly at court and walked in holding the hands of these two keyboard playing girls and said to everyone, just to clear out any ambiguity, Mesdames et Messieurs, je vous présente mes sœurs, les comtesses d'Epstein. That is, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you my sisters, the countesses zu Epstein, which was a great moment, one of the best moments in their early lives, because he clearly, very publicly claimed them as his sisters, ignoring the fact that they were his half sisters. These are my real sisters. You should treat them as such. And I think that they can owe that success and that the gratification that came with that, in part to their talent, to their music lessons, which had impressed him and many others. So just in conclusion, historical documents are always incomplete and require a lot of research and interpretation to figure them out. These two girls, they often studied music in one key at a time, probably because of their instruments, as we've said. Individual movements were often played alone. Bach's music was not especially popular in this time. In fact, I would go so far as to say Bach's music was unpopular, and that these girls were expected to play music which was primarily quick and virtuosic rather than slow and contemplative or improvisatory. And that girls were also not expected to compose or even copy music, but some did anyway, as we've seen in this example. So I've gone on for a long time. It's now 12:01. Perhaps you have to leave. I'm sorry about that if I talk too long.
I have a question.
I hope there are questions. Yeah.
I have a question. So they had to learn French also, I guess.
They did, yes. The French was the language of most courts in this era in Germany. It was the quite literally the lingua franca.
Andrew, when did they stop? It's so much better to put the stem on the right side than on the left side. When did it start being the way to put it on the left?
That happened more with the advent of printed music. It was still pretty unusual in Bach's time to print music. He had some of his music printed, but most of his keyboard music, like the Well-Tempered Clavier and the Inventions and Sinfonias and the French suites and the English suites, none of that was printed. Whereas by Beethoven's time, virtually everything that has an opus number was published and sold. Bach published almost nothing compared to what he composed. Beethoven published almost everything he composed. So that shift happened over the course of the 18th century. And as soon as people got used to reading music that was printed and kind of standardized, they started writing music in a more standardized way as well. But in Bach's time, it was really up to any given scribe how they decided what side of the note head they wanted to put the flag on. And sometimes you can see it migrating over the course of their long lives. You know, they just sort of get used to, they're doing it in the middle for a while and then on the one side or the other side. Sometimes it actually helps us date their handwriting to see that these individual characteristics.
It's so much easier to put it on the wrong side when you're writing.
Well, I mean, we're
What's
used
supposed to be wrong.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
I have a question too. Maybe you covered it and I missed it, but when you had the bookkeeping at the beginning, and it says like the musician made 4 groschen or 5 groschen, how much is a groschen compared to the value that we have now? Because I know, you know, that I grew up in Germany, and groschen at my time was 10 cents.
Yeah.
I'm assuming it was a little bit more at that time, right?
Yes. So the main okay, we're talking about the Holy Roman Empire. So you grew up in Hamburg, where they also had back then a very different currency system from the one that Bach would have known in Saxony. And there were different systems all over the place, so that people really thought of themselves as going to a different country when they went from Leipzig to Berlin or from Berlin to Hamburg. They thought of themselves as foreigners when they went to these places, and they really had to deal with different currencies. In Leipzig, or actually we should talk about Braunschweig and Curtin, where Mr. Hartung was living, there were 24 groschen in a Reichstaler. And I mean, I actually have a note about currency at the beginning of my book, if anybody's interested, where I go through and talk about what you could buy with a Reichstaler, what you could buy with a groschen or with 10 groschen, whatever. I should actually, so I have my book here. This makes a great stocking stuffer, by the way. I'll look up my note on currency and say what I said back then. So one Reichstaler I suggest is worth about $100, and there were 24 groschen. Let's see, with a single groschen, one could buy a portion of bread and butter, a couple of printed songs, or a published table of a courtly hierarchy. 1 groschen was worth 12 Pfennige, each of which might correspond to around 35 cents. For 6 Pfennige, one could buy rosin for a violin bow. For 3 Pfennige, some ink for writing letters. With a single Pfennig, one could purchase little more than a glass of milk. So, I mean, these calculations are difficult, and they're all done in sixes, so that 24 and 6 and 12, these are the sort of units of measurement at this time. Before the decimal system, people were thinking in dozens, you know. So it's very, very difficult to come up with exact equivalents today for groschen or Reichstaler in the past. It all has to be kind of relative within that closed environment. Yeah.
Do you think Bach's music was too difficult for them? I mean, that's why a lot of people don't play contemporary music today.
Yeah.
They can't figure it out. You think that's the reason?
It's true. I mean, Bach, all the music in this, the collection of these 2 girls I talked about, all the music that Mr. Hartung, the music teacher, had his students playing was contemporary music, right? Nothing was older than about 50 years. Most of it was very much more recent than that. So the problem was not that it was too contemporary, but I do think that Bach's music was and remains for many people too difficult to play, and not just difficult to play, but difficult to hear. Right. Not every teenage girl wanted to present herself as someone who was good at playing fugues. You know, there were all rewards and drawbacks of any approach to kind of presenting yourself in public. But my sense is that it was a minority of people for whom Bach was, who wanted to kind of project an image of somebody who was good at playing music like Bach, you know, professional musicians for sure. Hartung was a huge fan, but I think most people weren't. Yeah, more questions?
Was there a composer that we use today that was very popular at that time that you see?
Well, I'm not frankly aware of all the music you use today. You'll have to tell me. I mean, we can go back to that list, but my guess is, I mean, do you have your students playing music by Rameau or Couperin? Yeah. So
there's
yeah,
that one piece.
Handel for sure. Bach to a limited extent. my guess is you probably aren't having your students play a lot of music by Christoph Graupner, or these countesses, their very, very favorite composer, or at least the one that is best represented, was a Swedish guy named Johann Joachim Agrell, Agrell. And he worked in Germany and published a lot. He was very successful in his time, but is, you know, virtually forgotten today.
I had one question.
Sure.
I'm playing the Capriccio
Yeah.
by Bach right now.
Uh-huh.
Were they composing a lot of Capriccios back then? Because I didn't really know the name from back then, but when I looked in Groves, it seems like that was something that was composed. Was it a dance or is it a story?
Yeah, the word capriccio was used in all kinds of different ways, but it was most often referred to as a kind of free piece. It was like what you call kind of the equivalent of a fantasia or a fantasy or something like that. But capriccio later, even in Bach's lifetime, came to refer to more of an exercise. So a piece that might be written for pedagogical reasons. That's not the case, I think, with the capriccio you're talking about.
Right.
And that's a very early work for Bach. So it's really from the late, right around 1700, probably. We don't know for sure. But he was a young person when he wrote it, and it's obviously dedicated to his brother.
Right. They said he was 22 when he wrote it, because that's when his brother took the trip.
Yeah, but we don't know which brother and which trip and all that. So if you see very confident statements like that, you should not take them seriously.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, it might not even be a real brother, but rather a sort of friend who was as close as a brother or something along those lines. We really
love that piece. I just love
it. It is a great piece, very sentimental compared to a lot of the music he wrote around then. Cynthia?
Yes, I have a question. Other than the difficulty of tuning a harpsichord, how affordable was a keyboard instrument in those days? Because I know you listed all those people, and some of the parents were like farmers, and it didn't seem like they were part of the court.
That's right. Not everyone had a lot of money. So keyboard instruments could be, I mean, to buy a new keyboard instrument was a very expensive thing to do. Even a clavichord, which was kind of the lowest, the smallest type of keyboard. But Jakob Adlung, who was a contemporary of Bach, who wrote a book about music, writes that you could also buy keyboards for as little as 16 groschen, which is not very much money at all. You know, you could maybe the same price as a set of wine glasses or something like that. But he also says those are worth nothing except they're good for nothing except if you want to chop them up and burn them to cook fish. Then they're really useful. But otherwise they're not great. So, I mean, you have the full range. You could buy keyboard instruments used in the states of terrible disrepair. You could buy very, very fancy keyboard instruments. I actually have a chapter in my book about a keyboard instrument maker and the people to whom he sold his instruments, which is also very well documented. And if you're curious to know about like keyboard ownership and costs and types and stuff, that's all in there.
Thank you.
Sure.
What a great talk.
Thank you. Thanks for your questions, and thanks for your attention.
It was terrific.
Yes, thank you, Andrew. I thought so too. It was a very fun music history lesson, and I was wondering, the time was going so fast. Was it because I appreciated more now being out of school, or was it your captivating way and of talking and bringing that all alive? And I think it's both, but even more that you were able, in a very charming, comfortable way, to bring that life of the musicians there or the students alive. And I was thinking also, you know, as piano teachers, we are trying to teach our students to understand the musical expressivity, to relate with the music. And then many times you see there's a little bit of a disconnect, especially to Bach. And as you said, like prelude and fugues, because it's just so long ago and not a language that we talk on a daily basis. Nope. And I felt like just having these examples of their daily lives of these people at the time brought more of a relationship. So I'm glad that we recorded it, and we see if we can, I might use some of it for my performance classes with the older students. Elaine.
Just one last thing. Maybe the teacher had the student write down the music, because we do that with our students. We have them copy music and do composing, but also the little ones, we have them copy it so they learn how to, you read better if you can write it.
Yeah.
Maybe it was an assignment. Maybe they didn't want to do it. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah. No, you're certainly right to raise these questions. The reason I think that it wasn't an assignment is because they did such a terrible job and he didn't correct anything, you know. And also the fact that some of this, there are even sort of sketches and drafts and such. The younger of these two countesses clearly composed this music, and that's something that he might have, you know, put her up to as well. But the teacher seems almost more eager than the student to have this happen, right? I mean, he lays out this whole sonata and then writes out he adds the staff lines, but can't actually, she won't give him the music. It must have been sort of in her head or something, and she just didn't want to write it down. But my sense is she was a very talented young musician who had gotten used to playing in one key at a time and knew her way around the tonic and dominant kinds of polarities and knew the style of a minuet, and was able to make it go. So I sense from that enthusiasm and interest. And I should say, in response to Yumi's very generous comments, that I feel the same thing. I mean, I absolutely love this research. This is what I do. This is my very favorite thing to do all day. And I'm writing a book now about Bach's cello suites and violin sonatas and partitas and the people that were associated with that music, kind of in the same way. And I could really, if my back could handle it, I would just be sitting and working all day on it. So I appreciate I appreciate your attention and your shared interest in this material, because it really is a labor of love for me, and I'm happy to talk about it.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I think it was really super interesting to get a glimpse of how you research. I was always wondering what you do every year for 3 months over there, but we could see that you work really hard. So thank you so much. I put the link to your book in the chat, and Andrew, maybe you want to check the chat too. You have a couple of thank you messages.
Oh, okay.
I had also one teacher texting me privately that she's very interested in that book because it came really alive.
Good.
So thank you so much for sharing your time and your research with us. And we see you all at the November meeting in person, hopefully.
Thank
Great.
you.
Thanks.